The sun beat down on Redemption, Montana, with the kind of unforgiving intensity that baked the dust into a fine red powder. It coated everything: the tired wooden planks of the saloon, the rim of Jake's hat, and the weary hides of the horses tied to the posts along Main Street. For a man like Jake, born and raised in these parts, the heat was just another part of the day. His life was a simple rhythm of mending fences, tending to his mare, Willow, and the quiet solitude of the plains. Redemption wasn't a town of heroes. It was a town of survivors, and their survival depended on their horses. That afternoon, as Jake was leaving the general store with a sack of oats slung over his shoulder, he saw the old man. He was sitting on a bench in the sliver of shade offered by the blacksmith's overhang, his face a road map of deep-set lines. He was Crow, an elder by the name of Cale, who rarely came into town. His presence was quiet but commanded a silent respect. As Jake passed, Cale's dark eyes met his. "The wind carries a heavy heart today, cowboy," Cale said, his voice low and raspy, like stones tumbling in a dry creek bed. Jake stopped, nodding politely. "It's the heat, I reckon. Makes everyone tired." Cale shook his head slowly. "Not the heat, a debt is coming due. The land remembers." He reached into a leather pouch at his side and pulled out an arrow. It was unlike any Jake had ever seen. The shaft was dark, polished wood, fletched with the feathers of a great horned owl, and the obsidian arrowhead was chipped to a razor-sharp, lethal perfection. It felt ancient, heavy with purpose. "This is for you," Cale said, holding it out. "It seeks what is lost, but its flight demands silence in return." Confused but intrigued, Jake took the arrow. Its weight felt significant in his hand, cool against his callous skin. It felt less like a gift and more like a burden. I don't have anything to pay you for this," Jake stammered. "Your respect is payment enough," Cale replied, his eyes holding Jake's for a long moment. "Keep it safe. The night will test its meaning." With that, the old man stood up and walked away, disappearing around the corner as silently as he had appeared. Jake stood there, holding the sacred arrow, the setting sun casting a long, ominous shadow behind him. Jake sat on the edge of his cot, the rough wool blanket a poor defense against the chill seeping through the cabin walls. The moon cast long, skeletal shadows of sagebrush across the dusty floor. He tried to sleep, but Cale's words echoed in his mind, a low hum of unease. He glanced at the arrow, propped carefully in the corner. In the pale light, the obsidian tip seemed to absorb the darkness, and the owl feathers were utterly still. It felt like a silent observer, waiting. That was it. The silence. It wasn't the usual quiet of a Montana night, a peace punctuated by the distant call of a coyote or the whisper of wind through the pines. This was a heavy, profound emptiness, a vacuum. He strained his ears, listening for the familiar, comforting sounds from Willow's corral just outside his window, the soft nicker, the shuffle of hooves in the dirt, the occasional snort as she settled. There was nothing. A knot of cold dread tightened in his stomach. This was the silence Cale had spoken of. It wasn't just an absence of noise. It felt like a presence, pressing in from all sides. He pulled on his worn leather boots, his movements feeling loud and intrusive in the stillness. He grabbed his jacket, his heart thumping a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had to see. Outside, the air was crisp and cold, biting at his exposed skin. The world was bathed in an eerie silver glow from the full moon. He walked to the corral, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. He reached the gate, his hand trembling as he touched the familiar wooden latch. It was secure, just as he'd left it. But when he looked inside, a wave of cold shock washed over him. The corral was empty. Willow was gone. Panic clawed at his throat. He scanned the ground, desperately searching for any sign. A broken rail, tracks leading away. There was nothing. The dirt was undisturbed, save for the faint impressions where she had stood hours before. It was as if she had simply dissolved into the thin, cold air. A frantic, desperate energy seized him. He ran down the main street, a lone figure in the silent town. He checked the miller's paddock, then the stables behind the saloon. Everywhere, the same impossible scene repeated. Latched gates, empty corrals, and a silence so complete it felt like the end of the world. The paralyzing shock gave way to a surge of adrenaline. Silence was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a physical presence, a suffocating blanket over redemption. Jake's boots hammered against the packed dirt main street, the frantic rhythm the only sound in the universe. Each slap of leather was an indictment of the unnatural quiet. The cold pre-dawn air, usually crisp with the scent of pine and horse, was sterile and thin, burning his lungs as he ran toward the one building that served as both law and order. Sheriff Brody's office. He pounded on the heavy oak door, the sound echoing unnaturally loud. After a tense moment, a light flickered inside and the door creaked open. Sheriff Brody stood there, a formidable man in his late 50s with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. Or so Jake had thought. Jake, what in God's name are you doing raising a racket at this hour? Brody's voice was a low grumble, thick with sleep. They're gone, Sheriff, Jake gasped, leaning against the doorframe. They're all gone. Brody's eyes narrowed, his skepticism a palpable force. Gone? Who's gone? Calm down and talk sense. The horses, Jake said, his voice trembling but firm. Willow is gone. I checked the miller's place, the stables behind the saloon, they're all empty. Every single horse in town. There are no tracks, no broken fences. It's like they just vanished. The sheriff stared at him, his expression shifting from annoyance to clinical assessment. Have you been drinking, son? No, Sheriff. I'm telling you the truth. Jake's desperation was raw. He fought the urge to tell him about Cale, about the arrow that now felt like a cursed weight back in his cabin. How could he explain a prophecy to a man who only believed in handcuffs and evidence? The words would make him sound insane. Brody sighed, running a hand over his tired face. He saw the genuine terror in Jake's eyes, a look he knew wasn't born from a battle. It was the look of a man who had seen the impossible. All right, Jake, go on home. I'll take a look around. His tone was placating, the kind one uses on a spooked child. As Jake walked back through the silent streets, the weight of Brody's disbelief was almost as heavy as the silence itself. He knew what the sheriff would find, nothing. And he knew that when dawn broke, the town's quiet slumber would shatter into chaos. The first light of dawn spilled over the tobacco root mountains, painting the sky in shades of pale pink and orange. The cold, crisp air carried the scent of pine and damp earth, a familiar comfort that felt alien this morning. Sheriff Brody's truck crunched to a halt in Jake's driveway. He stepped out, his breath fogging in the chill, his face a mask of grim determination. He'd half expected to find Jake passed out, the whole thing a bad dream fueled by whiskey. But the sight of Jake, wide-eyed and shivering on his porch, confirmed the night's terror was real. Brody conducted his search with methodical precision. He examined the corral gate's latch unbroken. He walked the perimeter of the fence intact. He scanned the damp ground inside and outside the enclosure. Nothing, not a single hoofprint out of place, no sign of a struggle, no indication that a 1,000-pound animal had been led or forced away. It was as if Willow had simply ceased to exist. Brody's skepticism began to curdle into a cold, unsettling dread. This wasn't a theft, it was a violation of logic. The dread spread as the sun climbed higher. Phone calls began to trickle into the sheriff's office, then flood the lines. From the sprawling Miller ranch on the outskirts to the stables behind the saloon, the story was the same. Every horse in Redemption was gone. The unnatural silence of the night gave way to a rising tide of human panic. People gathered in the street, their voices a chaotic chorus of disbelief and fear. "It's impossible," shouted the rancher, his face flushed with anger. A whole herd, without a sound, amid the turmoil, all eyes eventually found Jake. He stood apart from the crowd, the arrow hidden in his coat, feeling like a block of ice against his chest. They remembered he was the one who had sounded the alarm. How did he know before anyone else? Brody pushed through the anxious townsfolk, his gaze hard and questioning. "You were the first, Jake," he said, his voice low but carrying over the din. "You need to tell me, right now, everything you know. And I mean everything." The sheriff's hand rested on his hip, inches from his sidearm. The implication was clear. Jake was no longer just a witness, he was a suspect. The walk to the sheriff's office was a gauntlet of cold stares and whispered accusations. Brody's office felt small, the air thick with the smell of old paper and stale coffee. He motioned for Jake to sit in a worn wooden chair across from his cluttered desk. The sheriff leaned back, his face a mask of exhaustion and frustration. "All right, Jake," Brody began, his voice low and devoid of its usual warmth. "No more games. The town's on edge and they're looking at you. I need the truth, everything." Jake's hands were clammy. He stared at a faded map of Bighorn County pinned to the wall, his mind racing. The truth sounded like madness. Silence sounded like guilt. He swallowed hard, the dry click loud in the quiet room. "I told you what I know, Sheriff. They were just gone." "That's not good enough, and you know it," Brody snapped, slamming his palm on the desk. The sound made Jake flinch. 47 horses don't just go. People saw you late last night, near the edge of town." "Where were you?" The question cornered him. He had to give Brody something. I ran into someone, an old crow man, Cale." Brody's eyes narrowed. "Cale from the reservation. What about him?" "He was just passing through," Jake said, his voice barely a whisper. He couldn't bring himself to mention the arrow. It was the centerpiece of the madness, the one thing that would make them lock him away for good. He'd said some strange things, talked about a great silence, about things being lost. I didn't think anything of it. The sheriff stared at him for a long moment, his gaze piercing. Finally he sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. "So that's your story. A cryptic native gave you a riddle, and poof, the horses disappeared. Jake, I've known you your whole life. I never took you for a liar." "I'm not lying," Jake insisted, his voice cracking with desperation. "You're not telling me the whole truth either," Brody countered, his tone flat. "I don't have enough to hold you. There's no crime scene, no evidence of a crime at all. But don't you dare leave town. You understand me. You're the only lead I've got." Jake nodded, defeated. As he walked out of the office and back into the harsh morning light, the faces of his neighbors were no longer just suspicious. They were hostile. He was an outcast. Brody's warning echoed in his ears, but another voice, Cale's, was louder. He knew what he had to do. He had to find him, even if it meant breaking the sheriff's one rule. The silence of Jake's small cabin was heavier than the one that had stolen the horses. It was a silence filled with accusation. Through his window, he watched the last sliver of the sun dip below the jagged horizon of the Bighorn Mountains, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. Brody's words echoed in his mind, "Don't you go anywhere." But staying was a sentence of its own. He was the town's ghost, a walking embodiment of their fear and confusion. He pulled the sacred arrow from its hiding place beneath a loose floorboard. The obsidian tip seemed to drink the last of the day's light, and the owl feathers felt impossibly soft against his calloused fingers. This was not a weapon, he understood now. It was a key. Cale hadn't lied. The silence had come. The arrow was supposed to find what was lost, and what was truly lost wasn't just the horses. It was reason, trust, and his own place in the world. There was no other choice. Defying Brody was a risk, but staying in redemption was a certainty of ruin. He moved with quiet purpose, packing a worn leather rucksack with what little he could carry, a bedroll, a canteen, a small bag of jerky, and a compass. He wrapped the arrow in an old piece of oilcloth and slid it carefully into the pack. He was no longer just a cowboy. He was a fugitive, chasing a riddle into the wilderness. Under the cloak of a moonless night, Jake slipped out his back door. He moved through the shadows, avoiding the single dusty road that cut through town. Every rustle of dry grass, every distant dog's bark sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He felt the weight of unseen eyes, the judgment of a community that had turned its back on him. He didn't dare look toward the sheriff's office. He reached the edge of town, where the tamed land gave way to the untamed wild of the Montana foothills. He paused, turning back for one last look at the scattered, flickering lights of redemption. It had been his home. Now, it was just a place he was running from. With a deep breath of the cold, pine-scented air, Jake turned his face toward the dark silhouette of the Bighorn Mountains and began to walk. Days bled into a haze of exhaustion as Jake pushed deeper into the Bighorn Mountains. The sharp, pine-scented air was a constant companion, the jagged peaks a silent jury to his desperate search. Finally, he saw it, a thin ribbon of smoke curling against the granite face of a distant cliff. Hope, raw and fierce, surged through him. He found the camp in a hidden basin, shielded by ancient junipers. Cale was seated by a small, smokeless fire, as if he had been waiting. He looked up as Jake approached, his gaze calm and steady. "The arrow showed you the way," Cale said, his voice as quiet as the mountain air. "Where are they?" Jake asked, his voice cracking with fatigue. "They were never stolen," Cale explained, gesturing for Jake to sit. "We borrowed them." Your town had grown deaf, Jake, deafened by the noise of trivial things, forgetting the land that sustains you, forgetting each other. We led the horses to a hidden valley, a place of profound quiet, to give you all a silence loud enough to be heard. He looked at the arrow in Jake's hand. That was not a tool of magic, but a symbol of trust, a promise that what was lost could be found again once its value was remembered. Understanding settled over Jake, heavy and clear as a winter sky. It wasn't a theft. It was a lesson, severe and necessary. "They will return at dawn," Cale assured him. "Go back. The silence has served its purpose. Now your people must learn to listen to the sound." Jake traveled through the night, his heart no longer heavy with fear, but filled with a quiet purpose. He reached the ridge overlooking Redemption as the first rays of sun crested the mountains. Then he heard it, a low rumble that grew into the unmistakable thunder of hooves. From the foothills, the horses emerged, a flowing river of life pouring back towards the town. Will trotted directly to him, nudging his hand. Townsfolk rushed from their homes, their shouts of alarm turning to gasps of awe. Sheriff Brody stood frozen in the middle of the street, watching the impossible unfold. His gaze met Jake's across the distance, the suspicion in his eyes finally dissolving into a profound, unspoken understanding. Jake's name was cleared not by an argument, but by the truth walking calmly back into its stables. Redemption had been given back its heart, and in the quiet that followed, its people began, at long last, to listen.